Good evening, day walkers and night stalkers. It's me, your twisted Southern horror queen, coming to you live from under a full moon right here in southeastern Louisiana. I'm glad you guys are hanging out with me tonight. I do so enjoy our time together. I love sharing all these urban legends and haunted history with all you creepy kids. And I want to remind you that if there's a legend or some other spooky place or event or something that you want to know more about in your neck of the woods or somebody else's neck of the woods, hey, shoot me a message because I love to dig into that kind of crazy stuff and fill you guys in on everything that I find out. And of course, if I can find out enough about it, I'll definitely use it as a topic on an upcoming show and give you a big old shout out from me, your friendly neighborhood creepy chick. Hey, Ryan, Lori, and there's Joe and my boy Ricky. Glad to see you guys jumping in on board tonight. Let's see. We got all kind of crazy stuff going on. Let's see. The first part of the show tonight is actually a result of somebody going, hey, I want to know a little bit more about this. And I'm not going to tell you what this is until we get to that point. But before we get rolling on that, got to give some love to all the Adrian's Fury Dragster sponsors. So here's a big, wet, creepy chick kiss coming to ya. Renegade Racing Fuel, Amelie Oil, D&M Graphics, Surreal Studios, K&N Filters, RJS, Racers Direct, Hawaiian Island Shine, and of course, my all-time favorite, Naked Wines. Gotta love me some Naked Wines. And also we had a raffle a little while back for some prime ad space on the Adrian's Fury Dragster fire suit for this season. And that raffle winner goes to Eddie Milburn of Kentucky, who is, as we know him, Crazy Thing Art. So he's going to be doing some badass airbrush work for us here in the real near future on the helmet for sure. Probably on a few of the creepy chicks' personal items, because that's the way I roll. I think he can do some badass art on my high top tennis shoes, right? We talked about that, and I think that's definitely going to have to happen. All right, so one last shout out before we get everything rolling tonight. That goes to The Edge Radio, and if you're not streaming The Edge for your tunes, you are missing out, slick. Check it out at theedgeradio.us. You can stream there, find out a little bit about the station and some of the talent on the station. We all sit there and listen to the FM radio stations and maybe a few satellite stations and stuff, but one good tune here, one good tune there, a couple of sucky tunes, some commercials, and then maybe sometime in the next half hour, they might play another rockin' tune. Well, it ain't like that on The Edge. It's all badass 24/7. Check it out. Fantastic music from the ass crack of dawn until sometime later in the evenings when shows like the Twisted Southern Horror Queen come on. Because that's where you can catch a lot of the playbacks. There, YouTube, Facebook, a little bit of everywhere. But The Edge is going to be live on iHeart, iTunes. It's live on a whole bunch of different platforms right now. Too many for me to list, so check that out. Certainly, you can catch some waves with The Edge on something that you're streaming already. Gavin Williams, glad to see you in the house. I'm hoping your package gets there pretty soon. Sent all your goodies out to you. First class, just like you, dude. Hey, Susie, that's my girl, my heart. Missing you, sweetheart. Hope everything's going good. Hoping you're having a fantastic week. All right, so I think we've got all the shout-outs out of the way, and it's getting to be about that time, kiddos. Yeah, you know what you got to do. It's time to dim the lights. Kick out the kids, lock the doors, and grab a tasty adult beverage of your own, because we're about to get our scary on up in here. But you knew that already, right? Yummy. So, like I was saying a little bit earlier tonight, the first part of the show anyways, being brought to you via a request from James Minix in Hot Springs, Arkansas. Now, Jimmy heard about the Myrtles down here in my neck of the woods. And I told Jimmy that I'd actually done a show on the Myrtles a while back, but dude said he didn't hear that. So if he didn't hear that, certainly somebody else might not have heard that. And he kept on, so he pretty much convinced me that I needed to do another show on the Myrtles. So if you've heard it before, maybe you'll learn something new. If you hadn't, when I'm finished with you tonight, you're going to know everything there is to know about the Myrtles Plantation. So I'm going to school you on it, folks. Pay attention, take notes. There's a test at the end of the show. So let's start at the very beginning, and that was in 1796 when General David Bradford, a.k.a. Whiskey Dave, of the Whiskey Rebellion, decides he's going to buy this 650-acre land grant from Baron de Carondelet. Now, Bradford had actually landed in that area after he fled the United States to avoid arrest and imprisonment for his involvement in the rebellion. But at that time, Bayou Sara, which is where he landed, of course, it was a Spanish colony and not part of U.S. territory. So just a little footnote here, folks. General Bradford was pardoned later on down the road by President John Adams. Keep that in mind because that'll be important later on. So now he's got this massive land tract and he's out of reach of the authorities, and all those folks, of course, wanted to see him hang. But he's doing all good and everything. So he starts trying to settle in. And of course, things are okay in the beginning, but it wasn't going to stay that way. Bradford starts construction on this main house, and this is pretty much where it all kicks off. So these workmen are digging out for the foundation when they unearth this old Indian burial ground. And Bradford did the way wrong thing here. Instead of relocating the site of the house, because there's like 650 freaking acres he could have built on, he decides that he's going to continue to work right there where he was. So he orders the workers to burn the remains that they had dug up and keep working. And of course, they did. So that pretty much marked the beginning of some pretty hard times for Bradford, as well as kicking off over 200 years of haunted history that are still being witnessed at the Myrtles today. Gavin said he's heard of the Myrtles. So anyway, after he's got everything rolling, Uncle DW, good to see you joining me from Carrier, Mississippi this evening. So after that, illness strikes all of the workers that had been involved in all this mess, and there was one obstacle after another that kept arising during the construction of this main house and all the outbuildings. And the dude, he was basically bleeding cash, and he was fighting with the workers and then going home to fight with his wife. And after all that, tragedy strikes, and one of his sons fell into the river one day while they were working on the estate, and his body was never recorded. That's right, very haunted, Susie. Hey, James, glad to see you this evening. So at this point, Bradford gets word that President Adams had pardoned him, and he was more than ready to get the hell off of that land grant in Bayou Sara by then. So he snatches up his wife Elizabeth and their remaining 5 kids, and they move back to Pennsylvania. Now, Bradford knew he had a career in politics sitting there waiting for him. All he had to do was show up. So he went for it full throttle, and he wound up being appointed Deputy Attorney General for Washington County, which you can't do a whole lot better than that. But in the meanwhile, the mansion was still in his name until 1820 when his son-in-law, Judge Clark Woodruff, talked him into selling it to him. So this Woodruff era that came about is responsible for producing one of the Myrtle's most well-known ghosts, and that is the ghost of a young Creole slave girl named Chloe. Now, Woodruff, he kind of had an eye for Chloe from day one. She apparently was a good-looking little Creole girl. But, of course, he'd get in private and he'd flirt with her. And needless to say, she didn't really shy away from him either. So Chloe winds up falling head over heels for Woodruff, which made her kind of obsessed with taking care of her kids and his house. And, of course, things started to progress, and she soon took the position as his mistress. Well, she eventually convinces him to move her into the house so she could take better care of the kids. And, well, that was just dumb as hell in the first place, moving your mistress into the house with your wife. So dude was pretty much asking for it, right? So Chloe kept a pretty close eye on everything that went on in his house, and she was becoming more and more involved in his everyday life, and she forgot to slow her roll. So Chloe starts eavesdropping on conversations and peeking in at the most inopportune moments. And The problem with this is that she wasn't really good at it. So she got cold busted more than once, and Woodruff was pretty much tired of scolding her. So Chloe was starting to become a problem, and it was obvious that she was gunning for a higher position than mistress, right? Well, one night, some of Woodruff's influential friends pop in one evening, and they're all sitting around the parlor, and they're talking about politically sensitive stuff, and all of a sudden, this conversation starts getting heated. So one of these dudes gets pissed off, and he storms out of the parlor door, and he catches Chloe with her ear to the wall. Well, he pitches a bitch fit. And, of course, he went back inside and raised some hell with Woodruff, and Woodruff had pretty much no choice but to punish her in front of everybody that was there. So at that point, he ordered her left ear cut off, and he banished her from working inside the house. Hey, Michelle Rush, good to see you. So Chloe is just freaking devastated at this point, and he's punished her brutally in front of witnesses. She just can't believe that he actually went there, and her heart was just absolutely broken. So she takes a few days to lick her wounds, and then she started plotting on how she could work her way back into that house. So she decided that she was going to bake a cake and lace it with poison herbs, but she didn't really have any intentions on killing anybody. She just wanted to make them sick. Because if the children came down sick, and surely she'd be allowed to come back in the house and take care of them, right? Well, we already know that she wasn't good at sneaking around, and apparently she wasn't much on baking either, because she used a little bit too much of those poison herbs, and the cake wound up being lethal. So Woodruff's wife, Elizabeth, and 2 of his kids actually die after they eat this cake. So now Chloe's beside herself because she really loved the kids too. The wife, not so much, but definitely the kids. And it was killing her to see Woodruff in so much pain, and her, of course, knowing that she was the one that caused it. So the guilt is just freaking eating her alive, and her heart was broken beyond repair. And days turned into weeks, and Chloe just couldn't bear the guilt any longer. And she goes to Woodruff, and she confesses everything. Woodruff ordered her to be hanged from one of the massive oak trees. It was just outside the front of the mansion. And when Chloe was dead, her body was weighted down and thrown into the Mississippi River. So Woodruff and his last remaining child at that point in time picked up, and they moved to Covington, Louisiana, which is just a little ways away from where I'm sitting right now. He sold the mansion in 1834 to Ruffin Gray Sterling. Now, Sterling and his wife did a massive remodel on this entire homestead, and when they finished, it was nearly double in size, and that's when it became what we know now as the 11,000 square foot Myrtle's Plantation. So the Sterling era would bring on even more apparitions that are still pretty much seen there today. Just 4 years after they wrapped up this remodel, Sterling dies from consumption. And believe it or not, that was probably a good thing for him, because in the following 5 years, 5 out of 9 of their children also died from various reasons. Only 4 of these kids wound up to be old enough to actually marry. Aloha, Doug Smith. Good to see you. So during this time, it was just the family was falling on hard times. The plantation was also suffering along with them, though, because this was during the Civil War era. And the Myrtles, along with many other plantations in southern Louisiana, fell victim to looting by these rogue soldiers that nobody was keeping an eye on. Hey, Cody, good to see you tonight. So, like I said, these thieving little bastards, they didn't really know what they were getting into when they charged the gates of the Myrtles plantation, because everybody in the family there, plus the slaves, were armed, and they knew what the hell they were doing with a gun, too. So these guys would show up, and of course they'd either die or get wounded, but eventually they'd leave, and they'd pretty much leave empty-handed. But it was during one of these attempted looting sprees that the Sterling's son-in-law, William Winter, was shot on the front steps, and when he was met face-to-face with some of these hostile soldiers. These guys were there to steal, and he was there to defend his home and his family, and he did just that till he got shot. So he's bleeding, and he crawls back into the house, and he makes it about halfway up the stairs, where he died in the arms of his frantic wife. So Now that you know a little bit about the Myrtle's history, I'm going to tell you some of the creepy stuff that's going on there, even today. So, a lot of the guests have reported losing just one earring while they're visiting the plantation. And later on, various earrings will turn up in weird places, and most of the time they're found by the staff while they're cleaning and organizing. No doubt that's got to be Chloe's work right there, because who else would only need one earring, right? Because she lost that left ear. Now, there's also reports of blood stains that show up on the floor whenever they feel like it, right there in that parlor. It doesn't matter how often they're cleaned, what they're cleaned with, what the case may be, they're staying there until they're good and damn ready to leave. And when they are ready to leave, the blood stains just up and disappear with no explanation. Now, of course, that's said to be one of the bloody reminders of a spot where some Union soldiers met their demise when they busted into the mansion and thought they were going to loot it. Not so much. So there's also the apparition of a man that's frequently seen on the staircase, and it's sometimes you can hear his footsteps as he's descending these stairs. The misty figure is described as a man that's dressed in his Sunday best, and a lot of people seem to think that it's the remnants of William Winter that died right there on those steps in his wife's arms. Hey, Rhino, good to see you tonight. It's been a while. You jamming still, my man? So back to Chloe, which is pretty much the main, not the main ghost, but the one that's seen most frequently there, and one that's probably the most active. She's seen a whole lot around the mansion and the grounds, and sometimes she's even spotted still hanging from the very limb where Woodruff had her hanged. There's this pretty freaking awesome, actually. It's a well-circulated photograph of this female apparition that appears to be that of a young slave girl that's just standing in between these two buildings on the property. Now, this photograph has been researched, investigated, and debunked by many well-known paranormal investigators. National Geographic has even used it in their documentary on the Myrtle's Plantation. It was also researched by Mr. Norman Benoit, who performed a shadow density test. And he concluded that all the physical measurements of the apparition were of human dimensions and proportions, like the circumference of the head, the length of the shoulder to the elbow, the length of the elbow to the wrist. They were all indicative of being human. Now, you're going to be able to see this freaking photograph on my blog Friday, so be watching out for that on Facebook at Southern Horror Queen. It's awesome. Hey, Joe, that's in my neck of the woods, honey. That's in Louisiana on the bayou, right there next to the Mississippi River. So the ghosts of children are also seen and captured in a lot of photographs all over the interior of the plantation, as well as on the grounds, too. But so many different children lived and died on this property that it would be pretty difficult to try to accurately identify any one of them. And two, back in the day, records weren't really kept on the slave population, so you really have no idea how many people actually died there, especially when you take into consideration the war factor, rampant plagues, and living conditions of that day just in general. So 212 years, man, that's a whole lot of ghosts that's probably roaming around on the Myrtle. So the ones we're talking about tonight may just be a small handful. But there is another picture that I'm going to post on my blog. It is from a school field trip where the teacher, I think, was taking a picture of a girl and another teacher, but in that back glass behind them is a window, and in the window is a reflection of a little girl's apparition, and it's pretty vivid too. There's no denying what's there, and it actually even looks like that apparition is acknowledging the camera, looking straight at it and kind of giving a half-ass smile. So, you know, both the current owners, the past owners, and the staff, they've all reported these mysterious things that happen there, and among those things are the mirrors that are there. I think there's one that's on display now, but at one time there were two, supposedly on either side of the staircase. And no matter how many times or what they used or what the case may be, they could never get the fingerprints, handprints, very small handprints, off of this mirror. And if for some reason they were lucky enough to be able to get it cleaned off, seconds later, those prints would just reappear. So it was a nuisance, but actually it's turned out to make those mirrors pretty notorious, and everybody's pretty much aware of them. What'd you say, Gavin? I watched some of the videos you posted on YouTube. Are you in like brain overload now? You're a strong man, Gavin. So the Myrtles, they've been visited and investigated a whole lot throughout history. Reports range from inconspicuous to the freaking insane there. Guests have had a lot of encounters with a lot of these ghostly inhabitants. And of course, many items have gone missing, and some overnight guests actually complain that in the morning when they wake up, they can't get out of the freaking bed because sometime during the night while they were asleep, something or somebody tucked them in so tightly, and the sheets are tucked in so tightly under the mattress that they cannot get out of the bed when they wake up in the morning. Hello, my dear. Glad to see you with me tonight. So, that's a place that I'd really like to stay, and we actually tried to make some reservations there at one point. Don't make the same mistake I made. If you want to go to the Myrtles, you better plan and make reservations at least 6 months in advance, because this sucker stays booked. Now, there are cabins that are outside that are typically a little bit more available than being inside the mansion, but these cabins are not original structures that have been there throughout the history of the Myrtles. So you really want to stay inside the plantation to get the whole full effect, and maybe Chloe will come visit you and take one of your earrings while you're asleep. All right, so from a haunted plantation down here in the deep south to 5 diabolically infested houses with some serious haunted histories. You guys hang on for this. This is going to be pretty sweet. So the first house that we're going to talk about is referred to by the locals as the Amityville Poltergeist House, not Amityville. We talk about Amityville here every once in a while. That's like one of my favorite hangouts. Hey, Susie, she said she's ready to go. Well, we need to make some reservations like now for next year if we want to go. There's some pretty cool rooms there, though. I think there's actually 6 rooms. They're all decorated in era furniture, and it would be pretty freaking awesome. I've talked to a few people that have stayed there, and every single one of them had some kind of encounter to relay after their overnight stay. So it would be well worth it. But anyway, Amityville, not Amityville. This joint's in France, and it's had all kind of madness going on inside of it for a very, very long time. But in August of 2014, it hit the headlines of every single paranormal news outlet on the planet when the resident poltergeist came unbolted and ransacked the entire house, and all the chaos went down while Chantal Hatchett was at home to witness it firsthand. Now, all of a sudden one day, out of nowhere, Chantel's at home, obviously the owner, and furniture and other things just start flying around through the air and crashing around haphazardly all around this entire freaking house. Some of the stuff was even being launched out the windows, too, and landed on the lawn. Well, of course, Chantel freaks the hell out, and she calls the police because she didn't have the numbers to the Ghostbusters. So, in the meanwhile, the neighbors are seeing, and they're hearing all this crashing and screaming coming from the house, and they're thinking somebody's getting their ass whipped in there. Well, one of the neighbors mans up, and he comes running over to see what's going on, and when he gets to the doorway, this vase that's filled with silk flowers lifts up off the table and flies at his head and smashes into his face. So thanks for stopping by, neighbor. Anyway, after that, the police show up, and this house is just freaking trashed. Well, they walk inside and they start looking around, and all of a sudden, as they're looking at everything that's kind of disheveled there in the house, the television set rises up from the entertainment center and lands at their feet. So I actually tried to do a little bit more research on the history of this house. I did find some stuff. Found some really cool pictures, but unfortunately, every freaking thing I found was in French. So yeah, I couldn't make heads or tails out of it. But what I did find is that the police wouldn't stand up behind the things that they witnessed or put in their reports. And later on, they actually coerced Chantel into making a statement that she caused all of this mayhem herself, even though there were witness accounts like the neighbor that wore the vase in the face and the police that saw the television set coming straight at them. So this whole thing gets nasty and it winds up going to court. Well, by the time or when it goes to court, the judge starts asking her questions and asking her to relay things and whatever the case may be. And it became very apparent that Chantel was illiterate, meaning there was no way she could have written her report. And if she did sign anything, there was no way she knew what she was signing. So the case was eventually thrown out, and Chantel never called the police back to the house. So we don't know what's going on there today or what happened in the past or what it was that actually caused all this stuff to kick up in the beginning, because as you know, any haunting is rooted in some kind of tragic history or violent past. But unfortunately, we don't know what that is with this case right here. So the next case, there's plenty of documentation on what went down in this joint. It's been dubbed with the name the House of Souls. And it's still standing in Voltri, which is in West Italy, or actually Northwest Italy, I think. But legend has it that during the Middle Ages, this joint was a popular inn that was usually filled to the brim with traveling merchants and soldiers and pilgrims, and whatever the case may be. But the kicker is that most of them would never make it any further than that inn. Let me tell you a little bit about what's going on there. We talked about a similar case in the Midwest here in the United States, but this isn't it. So there were these series of tunnels that actually ran underneath this inn. And the innkeeper during this time would send their guests down below into these tunnels to leave their belongings for safekeeping. Well, when these guests would start making their way down below into the tunnel to the safe storage room, they'd be murdered. And of course, all of their belongings were right there for the innkeeper to scourge through and take anything that he could find of value. Well, this madness goes on for years before anybody caught on to what was going on. And finally, when the authorities came to investigate, everything started to make a whole lot of sense. See, there had been this series of missing people in the area, and nobody really ever knew what happened. Of course, there was no Fox News or anything like that to inform you. So everything was kind of hearsay because none of these people were locals. They were all travelers, right? Well, when the authorities go in to investigate, they find these tunnels and they go down there and they start looking around and they see plenty of blood-stained walls, and there's stacks and stacks of all these missing people's discarded belongings crammed into the nooks and crannies of these passageways. When it became apparent what had been going on and what had happened to these poor missing bastards, the authorities started digging a little bit deeper. And when I say digging, I mean digging. And they found tons of mutilated pieces, parts that were exhumed from this property. In fact, every single reported missing person for a period of 12 years was located right there in the yard around this quaint little roadside inn. So with all that being said and done, the innkeepers were then arrested and executed because homie don't play that back in the day. Well, needless to say, after all of that insanity, nobody wanted to live in this joint. So it sat vacant and abandoned for over 100 years. Then times started getting hard after World War II, and this distant family member actually reluctantly winds up having to move in. This little area had been hit really hard with munitions, and this relative had definitely had his own experiences with the war. His home was one of the ones that had been bombed by these Allied fighters, so he and his family lost everything, and the only place they had to go was this ill-reputed old family property. So I'm betting that you've already guessed that they didn't stick around there for very long, right? Yeah. It may have had something to do with the harrowing cries of the innkeeper's victims that were echoing through the walls and through the floors of the house. Or it could have been the sounds of doors slamming shut at all hours of the day and night. Or Of course, there was nobody there to slam the doors. But my bet is on the numerous encounters that they had with apparitions that would appear from out of nowhere. These ghosts were still freaking out over 100 years later. They're still in shock over what happened to them. Some of them may not even know they're dead at this point. But most of them, yeah, they've pretty much caught on. And they're pissed. So this dude snatches up his family and they haul ass. And ever since then, the House of Souls has remained abandoned, with the exception of the spirits of those that were murdered there in the tunnels below. So pretty cool little story there. Now I got another one for you, though. This one is known as the Black Monk House. It's a little bit more common story, not here in the United States. This one comes from over the pond. It's just an everyday, ordinary-looking little house at 30 East Drive in Pontefract, England. But don't be fooled by its basic functional appearance. This little gem right here has gained a global reputation for being one of the most haunted houses in Europe. So its sinister reputation dates back to 1966 when the Pritchard family moved in with their 15-year-old son and 12-year-old daughter. I knew you had heard this one, Susie. Well, almost immediately after they get settled in, they start experiencing some harmless little incidents. So they're kind of catching on that the house is haunted. Well, at first, the stuff that was going on there wasn't really anything major, and the family as a whole was pretty much accepting the fact that whatever entity it was that was living with them was a family ghost, and they all start referring to him as Fred. Well, that was a mistake, because they're laughing off the fact that Grandma's picture keeps falling off the wall, or the TV keeps turning itself off and on, and their buddy Fred was digging his heels in there. It didn't take them long to figure out that Fred was bringing on way more than just a friendly Casper the Friendly Ghost kind of haunting. So, of course, things began to progress, and there was more going on there than Grandma's picture falling off the wall. The family starts hearing banging in the walls, and they're seeing these black, shadowy mists floating around the house. Furniture starts moving around, and of course various objects would be thrown around and come crashing into the walls or into the floor. But besides that, there were of course the typical freezing cold gusts of wind that would rush through the house, and then these puddles of water start manifesting just randomly throughout the house on the floor without any kind of explanation. Well, at that point, the Pritchards call in some professional mediums and paranormal investigators. Apparently, these folks didn't know what the hell they were doing, because things got significantly worse after their investigations were finished. And one night, the mother was woken up by the sound of her kids screaming their lungs out. So she jumps out of bed, hauls ass to the room, and she sees the dresser drawer opening and closing, and chairs are shaking, and the bed's bouncing up and down with her kid in it. So she goes to rush into the room, and this massive set of chest drawers slides forward violently and blocked the doorway so she couldn't get in. Well, by then, Dad's standing there, and he sees the whole thing going down too. So they force their way into the room, grab the kid, snatch the other one out of bed, and they haul ass. Well, they spend the rest of the night at the neighbor's house. So in the next morning, they're kind of cautious, but they go back home, and nothing really seemed to be going on there. In fact, the entire house was at peace. So they sucked it all back up and they went home. And after that, there was no paranormal activity whatsoever for at least 2 years. So Fred must have been off tormenting some other family. But when he came back with a vengeance. The era of peace at the Pritchard home ended abruptly when their daughter Diane was dragged up the stairs by her neck in front of the entire family. When the ordeal was over, Diane's neck was covered in marks that resembled handprints, and whatever it was that had attacked her went unseen, but it left behind plenty of evidence that it had been there. So everybody in the family starts having all these horrifying nightmares when they're sleeping, and when they're awake, they're seeing all kind of paranormal activity. And among one of the common experiences that they all had were encounters with this thing that they described as a dark, hooded, monk-like figure. And sometimes the monk would torment them in their dreams, but at other times, this evil little bastard would manifest right there in front of them while they were wide awake in broad daylight. That's a very, very bad sign, children. So this is how the house came to be known, actually, as the Black Monk House. So what's the story with the monk? Well, there was this paranormal investigator known as Tom Cuniff. And he went and he did a major investigation on the property and the history behind it and the immediate area right there. Now, he claimed that this black monk apparition is connected to the monastery that was in the same area from the year 1090 to 1539. Well, right before this monastery actually closed its doors, there was existing documentation of this monk that had been hanged there for the rape and murder of a young local girl. Now, the local gallows were said to have been just across the hill from where the Pritchard family home sat. So that explains a whole lot, right? It definitely explains the monk anyway. And I can't imagine that the monk would be the only spirit still lingering around in that area, considering how many people likely died on those gallows that were right across from the house. Well, after having found out that bit of interesting information, there was yet another attempt made to cleanse this house. And things seemed dormant right afterwards, but it only lasted for a few days. And at that point, the Pritchards decided that they had pretty much had enough of the bullshit, and they left. The house was put on the market, and because of its haunted reputation in that particular area, it pretty much stayed on the market for a very long time. But there was a point a couple of years later when the son did go back to do some maintenance on the outside. I think he was actually doing some lawn maintenance, and because they didn't go inside the house again. So it had to be something outside. Well, while he's out there, this neighbor walks up and, goes to talk to him, see how everything is going. And they asked about the new tenants that were staying in the house. And they were kind of complaining because the TV was being played way too loud and it was keeping her awake at night. And the son just kind of looked at her and shook his head and said, "There are no tenants. There is no TV. And there had been no power in that house since they left." So today, as far as I know, the house has no living residents, but there is still the occasional visit from paranormal investigation teams who have come to try their luck at catching a glimpse of the Black Monk on film during an investigation. And guess what? Some of them actually luck out. So that's another pretty cool little tale right there. Now I've got one more for you. Now it's kind of a remote tale. I don't think it's not very common. I hadn't heard of it till I ran across it a couple of weeks ago. But this is about the house that bled. So in 1985, Jean-Marc Belmer moved into this cute little house in San Quentin, France. And for the first few days while they were unpacking, everything seemed pretty cool, but once they settle in, they start noticing some weird stuff going on around them. So they kept hearing these loud phantom noises coming from out of nowhere. Well, at first they're thinking they just got some nosy neighbors, but after a while they figured out that these noises were coming from inside their house. So they're definitely pulling their freaking hair out, trying to figure out what in the hell is causing these noises and where exactly in the house it's coming from. But then other creepy things started happening. One day, Lucy was walking down the hall with a laundry basket, and she sees this weird-looking red stain on the wall. Now, it hadn't been there before, but she didn't really think much of it, so she just kind of wiped it off and kept going with her chores. Well, the next day, the stain was back again, but it wasn't just the stain. This time, this red fluid-looking stuff was oozing out of the walls. So she's freaking the hell out now, and she starts looking all around to see what this red stuff was and where it was coming from. And what she was finding, it's pretty much everywhere. It was on their beds, it was on their clothes, even on the stuff that had been put into drawers. So Lucy calls the police. You gotta wonder about these poor police, right? We're doing a show on that in a couple of weeks. So she calls the police, and I'm not certain what it was that she thought they could do about it, but of course she called them anyway, because who else do you call, right? So a little bit later, these two officers show up and they take charge of this investigation. Well, one of them, Brigadier in Chief Guy Piet, and the other one was Brigadier Pierre Separo. Well, they take a good look around at everything and they start examining this red stuff a little bit closer. And they were pretty much convinced that it was indeed blood, but they had no idea how it could have gotten everywhere that it was. So they start speculating on what it was that could have caused all of this mess. And what they come up with is a rather harebrained theory that some injured dog ran through the house and sneezed blood everywhere. So they decide to do a little experiment. And they sealed off the house and they put flour all over the floor to see if this dog came back, right? Hey, Jesse, nice to see you tonight. So they come back the next day after the house had been sealed off. And what they find is that there is more blood all over the place, but the flour had not been disturbed anywhere. So they call in one of their guys. He was a biologist. His name was Chance, Jock Chance. So Chance goes in the house and he looks around and he takes a few samples here and there, and he's pretty much baffled too. So he goes back to the lab and he runs a few little tests, and guess what? He finds out that it was blood. It was human blood. So that was pretty much it for the Belmers, and they packed their shit and they got the hell out. So this creepy little joint is just like several other poltergeist-infested homes. Once the family moved out, the paranormal activity just comes to a sudden stop. Nobody's lived in this house since then that's reported any kind of activity at all, period. And, we've seen cases like this before where the family's being brutally tormented in their home by something that's attached itself to them. And when they move away, of course, it just comes to a stop. The only thing here that makes any kind of sense to me is maybe whatever it is that's in that house that's tormenting these families just doesn't like the family for some reason or the other. But that's just my opinion. Anyway, the next case we got coming up is not really anything like the Belmer case. This is the case of the Demon of Brownsville Road. I would do the same thing. What's that? Haul ass and get the hell out? Yeah, me too, probably. So, Brownsville Road. You guys have probably heard this, but maybe under a different title. But let's go ahead and talk about it just a little bit anyway. This madness took root in 1792 during the Northwest Indian War. Now, the U.S. was waging war against all these local Native American tribes because they wanted to start settling in the area. Well, the problem was the Indians were already settled there, so that meant these soldiers were basically there to evict these Indians from their homes, dead or alive. Didn't matter. Hey, Lester, how you doing this evening? So these Indians, of course, they're pissed off, and they're not just going to pick up and leave so they're fighting back. And when these folks started settling in anyway, and they would sit back and let them get comfortable in their new homes, and then they would go and attack them. Well, one such story is about one of these raids that went down in a little town just a little ways away from Pittsburgh. There was a woman and her children that were murdered there, of course, by these Native Americans. Hey, Bill, how you doing tonight? So this attack was intended to keep more settlers from showing up and hopefully make the ones that were already there go some freaking where else, right? Well, this barbaric act was successful in doing far more drastic things than that. And some of the folks believe that when the blood of these murdered women and children seeped into the earth there, that something evil was born of it. So now it's 1988, and the Cranmers and their children move into their new home at 3406 Brownsville Road. Now, at this time, they had no idea, but their new dream home had been built on the exact site where these ghastly murders had went down over 2 centuries before, and where their bodies were still said to be buried in their front yard. Now, they may not have had any idea of the bloody history there, but even before they bought the house, they had a strong sense that something wasn't quite right there. The first thing that happened to them, that went down on the day of their final walkthrough before they even went to settle on this property. Hey, Paula, good to see you tonight, honey. So they lost track of one of their kids there. And they start looking around, and finally they found the little boy, and he's all curled up in a fetal position next to the staircase, and he's bawling his eyeballs out because he said he'd just seen a ghost. Well, I guess they just blew the kid off, and even though they both later admitted that they both felt something was there in that house with them watching them, they went ahead and bought it anyway, right? So a couple of weeks passed by, and they're all settled in the house, and they start noticing all kind of little odd things happening, but nothing really major, right? It was like lights turning off and on, and this one light in particular that had a cord, the cord refused to hang down. Every time somebody went to turn the lamp on or off, the cord was always wrapped around the globe of the light. So regardless if it had just been turned on or just been turned off, somebody would go back to tinker with it. And of course, there's that cord wrapped around the globe. These little events started turning into, of course, bigger events, because that's what happens, right? This thing had just kind of been toying around with him, but it decided it was going to start making its presence known. So sometimes it would manifest as this black, shadowy figure, and sometimes it would just fill a room with a foul and wretched stench. Now, we already know here on the show that that is a pretty good sign of being a demon. Hey, Brian, good to see you tonight, sweetness. So after all that, it was pretty much on in this house. The family starts hearing these footsteps and disembodied voices, and all the religious relics that they'd had scattered all around the house start disappearing, but they came back. They'd be found crushed or destroyed. They found these bent and broken crucifixes and shattered prayer beads all over the place. And the kids were waking up with these random scratches and bruises all over their bodies. Every single member of this family was being touched, pushed, pinched, slapped, beat by these unseen hands without any kind of warning. So beyond that, all of them were also suffering psychologically, because their every waking moment, their thoughts were being oppressed by something. And at night, while they were sleeping, their dreams were consumed with these evil creatures. So the oldest of the boys even began having this personality shift. Not a good sign. Of course, keep in mind, these are teenage kids, and a lot of paranormal activity starts kind of popping up around these teenagers. So in an already active house that has signs of demonic entities that are inside, beside the fact that there are other little critters attached to it, not good. So this kid starts turning violent, which was completely opposite of his typical personality. So at that point, the Cranmers turned to the Catholic Church. Well, the church viewed this situation not as a haunting, but as a possession. Maybe with the boy, I could see something afflicting him, but a thing cannot be possessed. It can be attached to, hey, Kareem, good to see you. And it can have something afflicting there, but a thing cannot be possessed. Just wanted to get that out there. Anyway, after a brief period of observation, this priest was sent in to perform a blessing on the house. So it was kind of a half-assed attempt, if you ask me. So this priest shows up with his stole and his prayer book and his holy water, right? Yeah, well, whatever was inside this house was not happy to see him. When this priest walks in, he felt it. He knew that he wasn't welcome there. So he starts his blessing right at the front door before he even walks all the way in. But when he started flinging his holy water around, this demon reacted by flinging blood on the walls. The Cranmers later stated that the walls looked like they were freaking bleeding. The thing is that these walls were like 10 feet high. Now, nobody could have climbed up there and dumped buckets of blood down these walls without a ladder, and the ceilings, there was not a spot splattered on them. So that tells you right there that nobody flung it up there from the floor. So at this point, this priest is pretty much out of there. But he did at least go for some help. It took a team of exorcists right at 2 years to clean this house of the demon that had taken hold there. I think it was the way wrong approach, but I wasn't there. Anyway, Cranmer has written a book about his family's experience while living in the Demon House, and this book is entitled The Demon on Brownsville Road. So check it out. I bet it's a pretty freaking interesting read. Now, we got one last crazy haunted joint for you guys this evening, and I think you're going to like this one. This one is about 50 Berkeley Place. That is across the pond. So, this is possibly London's most haunted house. It was designed and built by William Kent in the late 18th century. And you'd have to wonder just exactly what the hell they put in these bricks, because immediately upon the beginning of the construction, the neighbors there start telling ghost stories about these sinister residents that are living there. Now, one of the first stories upon completion was about this young chick that folks kept seeing hanging from the windowsill on the 4th floor. They said that she would just scream at the top of her lungs and then let go of the window casing and fall to her death. But the thing was, she disappeared before she hit the ground. This story probably originates from a legend of a girl named Adeline that did jump to her death from that 4th-story window in 1789. Folks say that she was running from her abusive uncle. And ever since she died there, folks have seen her jump from that window, always disappearing just before she hits the ground. But Adeline's also seen and heard on the top floors of this house. Now, you can hear her moving furniture around and knocking on the doors and knocking on the walls, but she's not the only ghostly resident that's there. There are stories there about this brown voided mass with tendrils. Now, it's not a ghost, it's something else. But this something is said to be so wicked and sinister that it is said to drive folks who run into it absolutely insane if they don't wind up dead. So, there's been a whole lot of investigations that have gone down at 50 Berkeley. Now, some of them were successful in capturing activity while they were there, but some folks left there only remnants of their former selves, and some unexplainably died while they were inside. So, in 1872, aristocrat Lord George Littleton stayed there overnight on that 4th level, or basically the attic bedroom, on a dare. Now, in his educated opinion, there was no such thing as ghosts or any other mystical creatures of the night. We know how that goes, right? So this dude has a bed set up, and he shows up later that evening with a shotgun, because it's really a shotgun. He's an educated man, right? So anyway, he falls asleep, but something wakes him up in the middle of the night. So Mr. There's No Such Thing as Ghosts looks up to see this brown, misty creature floating towards him. So what do you think he did? He shot at it, and then he hauled ass. Well, the story picks up in the morning, and Lord Littleton is searching the room for signs of where he fired his gun. Well, there's no scars on the wall, and there's no trail of blood, so he was definitely perplexed. So when he goes to leave the house, folks start showing up to see if anything happened during his stay there. His response, his conclusion was the upper level rooms were supernaturally fatal to body or mind. So I'd say he was turned into a believer overnight, right, folks? Well, 7 years later, it's 1879, and there's this new family that's just moved in. So they're all getting settled in, and the oldest daughter gets news that her fiance was coming to visit. So they send the maid up to the attic room to go freshen it up for him. Well, she wasn't up there very long before everybody in the house hears her screaming her freaking lungs out. So the entire family goes running upstairs to the 4th room to see what the hell her problem was, right? Well, they find her curled up in a corner, screaming over and over and over, "Don't let it touch me. Don't let it touch me." So nobody could get her to settle down. Well, after a few hours of this insanity, the family has the local nut house come and pick her up, and she dies the same day in that local insane asylum. In the meanwhile, the fiance arrives, and he's seen to the room to rest up before dinner. Well, he's not up there 30 minutes, and all of a sudden, everybody in the house hears him screaming his lungs out. And then there was a gunshot. So when everybody gets upstairs to see what the hell had happened, this dude was found laying dead on the floor with no injuries and no gunshot wounds, obviously, no scars in the wall, no blood on the floor. He was dead with just nothing wrong with him. So everyone formed the conclusion that the fiance died out of fear. After the news about all this madness hits the street, this nobleman shows up and he decides he's going to investigate the house. So he tells the family, or the family actually tells him about the maid and tells him about the fiance and some of the other crazy shit that's gone down there since they moved in. Well, this dude was a skeptic, to say the least, but to get to the bottom of the matter, he himself was going to spend the night in that attic room. So the family was terrified for him because they knew something was going to happen to him. So they installed this bell system for him. And that way, if he started freaking the hell out in the middle of the night, he could ring the bell and everybody would come running up the stairs and try to rescue him and find out what's going on, whatever the case may be. Well, the evening starts out okay, because it usually does, right? Well, eventually the middle of the night creeps up on him. The house is still. Everybody's asleep. All of a sudden, this bell starts ringing like crazy. So everybody jumps up out of their bed and they haul ass up to the attic room. But they were too late. This dude was laid out on the floor, deader than hell. So now there's another documented case of somebody who was literally scared to death in this house. So the next person moves in, and that person was Prime Minister George Canning. He immediately starts babbling to his friends and neighbors about these noises that are coming from the upper levels of the house. Anything from knocking, bells ringing, screaming, and furniture moving around. So needless to say, he didn't really venture upstairs very often. And he didn't live there very long either. So the next occupant was this renter. And it was a 90-year-old woman that actually wound up dying in the house. But that was likely of natural causes because you know her old ass wasn't walking up 4 flights of stairs. And she was probably too deaf to hear what the hell was going on up there anyway. So now it's 1885, and the house was purchased by Viscount Bearstad, who then leased the house out to this other dude known only as Mr. Myers. Well, Mr. Myers had rented the joint because he was fixing to get married, and he wanted a nice place for him and his wife to live. So he moves in ahead of the wedding, and he has the whole place decorated for her, and now he's eagerly awaiting the day that he's going to become her husband. But it would never be. Only days before the wedding, this tramp hauls ass, and he never hears from her again. So Myers became a recluse, and he pretty much never left the house. He fell into this deep depression, and he pretty much barricaded himself into this attic room where he slowly started losing his mind. Hey, Steve, how you doing? So he would only leave out of this room at night. And we know this because the neighbors reported seeing him walking from room to room upstairs with his candle held out in front of him. Well, a few weeks go by, and the neighbors realized that they hadn't seen him on his nightly candlelight march. So out of concern, they go over and they go to check on the old dude. Well, Myers was found sitting in the corner of the attic room, and he was freaking catatonic. He was, of course, shipped off to the local nut house, where he died just a few days later, just like the maid. So now it's 1887. The house is dilapidated. Nobody from around there had any kind of interest in moving into that joint, right? So luckily for the house, there would still soon be some more victims. Hey, Brandon, working late tonight, huh, honey? It's Christmas Eve, and this military vessel had been harbored in London. These two sailors, Edward Blunden and Robert Martin, they were going to make a night out of it. So they go out on the town, and by the end of the night, they realized that they had just had a really good time because their flat ass broke, and they're too drunk to make it back to the boat. So they're wandering around, and they literally stumble onto a vacant house at 50 Berkeley. So they go inside, and they settle in on one of the second floor bedrooms. Well, a couple of hours later, Martin wakes up to the sound of heavy footsteps coming toward him, and suddenly the door swings open. Well, this brown, misty creature comes floating into the room. Well, the first thing he could think to do is he's going to arm himself. So he grabs the fire poker from out of the fireplace. This entity, of course, saw that as a threat, so it descended on him and entrapped it in him in these tendril things it's got going on. So this dude's wrestling with it, and he's trying to free himself. And in all this commotion, Blunden wakes up, and he sees all this madness going on, right? So he hauls ass out of this house, and he goes to look for help. And eventually he runs up on this constable. So Blunden's babbling his story to this constable, who no doubt was more than well aware of the things that went on at 50 Berkeley. So eventually he winds up persuading this cop to go back to the house with him. Well, when they ran up on the second floor bedroom, Martin was nowhere to be found. The two of them start searching the house. They go floor by floor, room by room, and eventually they found him. He was in pieces down in the basement. So after that, the house stayed vacant for quite some time, but there were still plenty of reports that were filed by neighbors and pedestrians. The sounds of screaming and gunshots and windows slamming and bells ringing and all kind of madness, not to mention the ghostly specters that made their appearances nightly. This house was not occupied again until 1935, when this elderly couple moved in. And just as before with that 90-year-old woman, nothing was reported out of the ordinary there. Maybe the ghost just liked old folks, or maybe like the old woman, they didn't go up on the fourth floor, and they damn sure didn't hear anything that was going on. So after that, it's 1937, this bookstore or book dealership moves in. Now, both the owners and the staff have reported hearing some noises coming from these upper level rooms. However, nobody ventures beyond the first floor, so there have been no major occurrences reported. And that's about a wrap for me tonight. I hope we got enough creepy, enough haunted, enough scary in this show for you tonight. If not, you can always tune in next week, and you can always let me know, hey, creepy chick, I want to hear about this, or I want to hear about that. Let me know if there's haunted history or legends or urban legends that you want to hear about, because I love digging into that kind of stuff. And I want to thank you again for joining me tonight. And make sure when you're ready to rock out and you're tired of your regular FM radio, theedge.us, theedgeradio.us. Stream live. We'll have apps up real soon. There are several platforms that it's available on. I see you just scared the hell out of me because I thought one of the masks was acting up. All right, folks, again, thank you for joining me. Now that I can get my heart back down where it's supposed to be. Y'all have a creepy night tonight. What is that? The crosslit light. I'll look into that. Where is that, Brandon? Let me know where that's out of so I can do some research. And y'all have a good night. We'll see you next Tuesday night, 7 Central, 8 Eastern, right here on Facebook at Southern Horror Queen. Come get your creepy on with me, y'all.